Hello, welcome to Fundamental Friday, put on by the fine folks at PAS. My name is Sean Womack. I am the current chair of the Marching Percussion Committee and hosted the last couple of these fun little get-togethers. And our guest today, to the other screen of me, is Mr. Mark Reilly, Sergeant Major with the Old Guard. And I wore my shirt, Mark, so...
Nice.
Representing those guys today. Awesome. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. So listen, man, if you guys have tuned in before, we have our sticks and some pads, and we're gonna kind of drum along. Mark's gonna lead us through some Connecticut halftime and talk about some rudiments and some interpretations and some form, and should be a ton of fun. If you have any questions, jump in, type them at the screen. We'll get them to Mark and get them answered. So grab your sticks and let's have fun and give it up your virtual hands for Mark Reilly.
All right, everybody. So obviously the Connecticut halftime is what's considered to be one of the classic pieces. So I decided to pull out my drum instructor's 1954 copy of the Burns-Moore book. So if we look at that, that's where I see copy of the Connecticut halftime. So we'll be playing off of that today. But I kind of wanted to talk through some of the ideas of what makes a classic piece. All right. So we talk about rudiments, we talk about rudimental drumming, and we think about the complexity of rudimental drumming and how complex it has begun or has become due to a lot of different factors: technology, education, quantifying of things. So this piece is kind of basic when you think about the structure of it. It's in 8-bar phrases, repeated patterns, kind of this paradiddle check that happens every third bar throughout the piece. So if we break down and we look at the rudiments that are inside of this piece, it starts with a 7-stroke roll, starting from the left to the right, into 2 flams, 7-stroke roll into 2 flams, 7-stroke roll into 2 paradiddles, tap, flam, flam, same thing repeats. So that's what we call our A phrase. So our A phrase is played twice. We look into the next line, line 2, third measure. We have a 7-stroke roll into a lesson 25. So that's our next rudiment. So if you think of this kind of as a stock check, the flams being the check, the next rudiment we start to enter is the lesson 25, 7, lesson 25, going into the paradiddle figure again, lesson 25, 7, lesson 25, rinse and repeat. That's our B phrase. So we have an A phrase, then our B phrase. If we look at our C phrase, we have a 7-stroke roll into 2 15-stroke rolls. We're going to have some fun with that and how we can interpret the 15-stroke roll. So if you think about it from a mathematical point of view, everything else that we've had thus far breaks down into kind of 8th notes, 16th notes, or 32nd notes. The 15-stroke roll, if we take the downbeat away, we have 14 strokes. So 14 strokes, if we take the check of that, broken in half, that's a 7-lit over 3 8th notes, so the dotted quarter. Then it goes into our paradiddle figure, into lesson 25. So when we start to play with the 15, we're going to talk about 3 or 4 different ways actually how to play a 15 that's not super quantified, where it's a 7-lit over 3 8th notes. Maybe it's a triplet into 16ths. Maybe it's more dupled with a rough figure in front of it. We're going to play around with how we can work that out. So we have our A phrase, we have our B phrase, and then we have our C phrase, and finally we have our D phrase. So 7-stroke roll, if we look through it, we're on line 1, 2, 3, 4th line down, 1, 2, 3, 4th measure, pick up 7-stroke roll, drag paradiddle number 2, back into our check of paradiddles, lesson 25. That's one whole time through just the first pattern of Connecticut halftime. And it has 4 different variations past that. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But for now, we're going to do 7-stroke rolls and how we would possibly play those. So there's 2 different ways you can play them in here. We can have them E end of 1. So that's basically our 16th or 32nd note check. Or we can interpret it as a true 8th note with the triplet. So we're going to go with the triplet version first, and we're going to play ra-cha-cha, ra-cha-cha. We're going to play through just that A strain. Okay, so we're not going to play the lesson 25. So here we go. 1, 2. So here, if we look at this, we know we've got the 8-bar structure, and we'll play it again. There's accents on the end of the 7. There's no dynamic marking really given. And if we look underneath it, it says Scotch BD, meaning Scotch bass drum. So there were different types of bass drumming when this was written. If we look at it, this is a 1954 copy. Burns Moore, one of his big claims to fame, he was an amazing drummer, an amazing teacher, but he was also the first president of the National Association of Rudimental Drummers. So in 1933, at the American Legion Convention in Chicago, we have the NARD, which is created. And so Burns Moore was the first president. I think it was until 1945, the middle of World War II, he was the president. So he started putting a lot of this together. He was also a percussionist in the New Haven Symphony Orchestra. So he started putting a lot of these rudimental drumming features that were military-style rudiments and started quantifying them kind of into a classical feel, military into civilian usage. So we look at this piece of material here. We don't have a tempo marking, and we don't have a dynamic marking. So really, it's kind of up for us for interpretation. So we're gonna have strong flams, and then we're gonna have our paradiddles. We're gonna play that one more time for you. 2. All right, so that's just the A strain right there of the Connecticut halftime. So, Sean, do we have any questions at this point?
Specifically, yeah, Mark, but I think one thing that's important to note, I think anytime you learn about this, but just, you know, the form and the structure of everything and how that really relates and dictates to what's going on. Sometimes it's easy to look at that and kind of those things get jumbled together, but really understanding, you know, the phrasing of the rudiments and where those A's and B strains are.
Right. So if we take this, the next strain, I think this will help kind of bring into a discussion now about what beat gets the emphasis. So the B strain has this less than 25. And you can hear I'm kind of giving this scoop to the rudiment, and I'm giving it kind of a shape to it. So if we take it a little bit slower, if we think historically, each rudiment was actually given its own shape. So you didn't learn a pattern of 16th notes and said, play an accent on 1, play an accent on 2. They would say, no, this is a paradiddle. The paradiddle is a high stroke, or we start with the left, high stroke, rebound stroke, tap, tap, high stroke, low stroke, tap, tap, a rebounding stroke. And so each of these rudiments has a phrase. So the less than 25, if we think of it as 16th notes, and we diddle the E, it was never really played that way. It was given this idea of a shape to the phrase that it was going into. So a little crescendo. So we're going to add a little bit of that crescendo on the B phrase. So let's play the B phrase together 2 times through. 1, 2. Okay, so the idea of the next section we have here is these 15-stroke rolls. These 15-stroke rolls can be the 7-lit over 3s. Okay, or what I like to do is take a triplet roll, meaning a triplet 7, into a 9-stroke roll. And then kind of blend the two together. So there, we can crescendo that roll, and we think about it, that beat, the big beat that we've had for almost this entire piece, has gone from the 8th note in the first one to the quarter note in the second one. Now we have a half note beat that we're filling up. So however we choose to interpret it, we have to look at the beat structure of what we've got going there.
Hey, Mark.
Sean, do you have any questions on that?
Yeah. A couple, actually. On the 7-stroke, could you talk about like what determines the interpretation of that versus at the very beginning you talked about the duple interpretation of the 7 and the triplet. What determines that roll interp?
So that historically, that would have been from your instructor. So where you learned to play would have dictated that. So I grew up in New York well, it doesn't matter. I'm the young guy, right? So a lot of the old guys out there are like, oh, you're super young. You don't know what you're talking about. But my drum instructor was Nick Antanasio, and Nick started drumming in 1932 in Manhattan. And so he played with Moeller, he played with Les Parks, he played with Bobby Thompson, he played with Eric Perilou, he played with Sturts, he knew all these guys. And so as a youngster, I was kind of taught that the way you hold your left hand, if you're a good drummer, is you hold it like this, which is this Bobby Thompson, Eric Perilou style. And I didn't know why. I was just told if you're good, you play like this. Later on, I found out there was this feud between the New York guys and the Connecticut guys. And basically, this was the New York way to play, you know, with the beautiful left hand, thumb pulled here and the pinky and the nice hello action with the middle finger, which you have to be careful of, you know. But their style of playing was what they called a zippy style. And it was very much waiting very late for the 7-stroke roll to play. So instead of it being, it would be more like this. So almost 9-lit in style. And they would play it with this really tight interpretation for the triplet. So a lot of the older styles, like if you look in the Moeller book, Moeller had a lot of fluid motion going on. And Moeller was known to really take what he saw from the Civil War drummers and try to codify that. And the Civil War drummers were playing on open skin heads. They would have had no muffling in them, and they would have been really using a lot of arm to get that motion going. So if you look at the style arms are put together, and you look at what was written in the book, so the Moeller book would never have had an interpretation of, like, that's completely anti-Moeller. So Moeller, if they would have played this kind of piece, there would have been that 7-stroke roll of. So you kind of have to do your homework a little bit on the author of the piece of music, and then also the time frame when it was written. So if you hear Yankee Doodle being played, we play it like this. But these 7-stroke rolls are way more New York, New Jersey style modern rolls than the colonial uniforms that we wear in the old guard. So we would have been more of really slow and just not really that zippy interpretation. So that's a super long answer, but you have to do your research on how long ago was the piece written, and then who was the person who wrote it. So there's not really a super simple answer.
No, that's great, man. I think I think the when you shine a light on a lot of those things, we realize there's a lot of different ways to do that. So it's great information, Mark. Well, listen, man, let's talk about some 15. So I'll let you jump back on that where you cool. Just were.
So we're gonna go to the 15-stroke roll, and we're gonna play it. We're gonna try to play it as exact as possible as a 7-lit with the diddle interpretation. So we're just gonna play just that much, just the 7-stroke roll into the 2 15s with 8th note pickup 7. 1, 2. 2, ready, and. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to take the first left hand of the 15 off, and we're going to make it a duple 13-stroke roll. So here we're just going to take the 7 away and go. Okay, 1, 2, ready, and. Same thing. Good. So what I want you to do is add a drag right before it with the left. 2, ready, and. So we're adding this right before the duple 15, and we're going to try to keep it as duple as possible. 1, 2, ready, and. 2, ready, and. Okay, so the next one is going to be the 7-stroke roll into the 9. I think we had done that a little bit, but let's add a crescendo to it and try to blend it. So as the hands are coming up, we're actually going to let the hands come up and slow down a little bit. So for you music educators out there, I know this will drive you nuts, and it's one of those things, if we can think of the quantification of it, and then we can change the roll base from triplet to duple, it gets really tasty and really interesting in a very simple rudiment. So here we go. We're going to try let's do the check. Okay, that a couple times. 1, 2, ready, and. Last time. Good. So let's roll that. Let's diddle that. 1, 2. Last time. All right, now we're going to try to blend it. So let's crescendo it. Okay, we're going to try to crescendo that sucker. 1, 2, ready, and. 2, ready, and. 2, last time. All right, so that's just a way to think about playing it. So we're going to play the B strain, sorry, the C strain, which is the 7, 15, 15, paradiddle, lesson 25, 2 times. 1, 2, ready, and. Good. So if we think about beat structure, if we think about beat importance, the first strain we have, the A strain, it's obviously an eighth note pulse. Rum bum bum, rum bum bum, zucka dicka 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 dum bum bum. With our quarter note being the paradiddle in the middle. So eighth note, paradiddle is our phrase structure there. If we go to the B strain, we have our lesson 25. We can have it as an eighth note, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility with the interpretation of being allowed to do the lesson 25 with that scoop. And then we can kind of play with that rhythm a little bit if we're playing within the rhythm of a quarter note versus the structure of an eighth note. So we think eighth note pulse on the A, we think quarter note pulse on the B. The C strain, if we think of that dotted quarter with those 15s, it allows us some flexibility. If we go to the D strain, now we have choices. So it can be ba ba bugga dugga ba ba bugga dugga. Okay, it could be eighth note, or it could be ba ba dugga dugga ba ba dugga dugga. It could be quarter note. If you take the phrase structure of the 15-stroke roll and apply that, you actually start to think about the drag paradiddle number 2 being its own rudiment. A lot of discussion happens with the rudiments that they're really repetitive. You have Radimacue, double Radimacue, triple. Well, why? If you think about it musically, those are the differences between a quarter note, a half note, and maybe a whole note structure. So if we think of this as a half note structure, we're not going to be playing like this. For one, it's not written that way, but two, it takes a lot of the music out of the half note feel of it. And we can crescendo that paradiddle figure to the half note. So let's go ahead and play it that way, a little bit slower. Here we go, a little slower, and let's put those crescendos in the drag paradiddle number 2. Keep our paradiddles kind of straight away, and then a little scoop on our lesson 25. 1, 2, ready. I kind of slid into that open 7-stroke roll. So let's try it one more time with the six tuplet, the triplet bass 7. 1, 2, ready, and. Good. So let's put that all together. We're going to play the Connecticut halftime just the first time through. We call that basically the stock part to Connecticut halftime. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and. And there we have it. That's the first time through Connecticut halftime. So Sean, I think we want to do a little bit of some discussion here with some questions that we have and go from there and see what kind of stuff we can answer for folks.
Yeah, I think, man, I have one question. I know you talked about some of the, some of the stuff with the 15-stroke roll, doing the triplet into the duple feel and then smoothing that out. Man, is that the same approach that you guys would take, say, with the line with the old guard? Is that something you would do with all of those guys? And then are there any other exercises that you do with that to smooth that out? Because I know that at least with the students that I teach, that's always a challenge, right? Finding that something that's not really quite as metric as they want it to be.
Right.
So are there any other things that you guys do to just kind of get that feel and understand that a little bit better?
We have, and I mean, quite honestly, there's a lot of great minds that are in the old guard drum line, and it used to be this experimental battlefield, if you will, of, what's right, what's not right, what should we allow ourselves to do, and what do we need to keep the box of. And so that's one of the things from a performance point of view of the ceremonial stuff we do is pretty straightforward. It's really kind of just, it's stock, not a lot of complicated stuff in there, but because it's not complicated, we try to put a lot of flavor in there. So we have what we call the ancient roll exercise, which is all the ancient style rolls: 7-stroke roll, 11-stroke roll, 15-stroke roll. And a lot of people would ask the questions of why 11, why 7, why 15, why not 5, why not 13, why not keep it duple? But back in the day, the tempos were a lot slower, and they needed that space to be filled up by the extra diddles. So what we've had to do is figure out, when are we keeping time straight, and when are we giving this kind of breath? When do we choose to allow the breath? So
right.
We took an old Blue Devils exercise from back in the day right, and we would just play that, and where the flams would be, we would insert the regular, flam taps, inverts, 30-second no paradiddles, whatever.
Right.
But then we start getting into, all right, if the beat of a 15-stroke roll is the half note, how do we start to mess with this? So we would start with the 7. And so instead of, and we would put a triplet there. Okay, well, if we want to stretch that 7 and we want to stretch that triplet out, we'd have center snare, figure out where the lift was going to be with the hands, and everybody had to stand on the side and watch peripherally where the hand was going to be so that they can get the delay. So we would play something exaggerated, would be. So that's where. So we would do something like that, and we would do that with the 7, which almost now puts you in 6/8 instead of it being 5/8 at that point. So it was always kind of this kind of brain messing with your brain a little bit. So that's something we would do with the Blue Devils exercise. And we'd figure that out. But another one is trying to figure out just what is the bass rhythm that you're trying to play, right? So if you have a 16th note rhythm going into an 8th note rhythm going into a triplet 8th note rhythm, when you have those kind of rhythmic structures, the hardest thing in the world is your ears play games with your mind that plays games with your hands based on where you are also in the ensemble. So if you're front field and you're listening back field, or if you're over on the 30-yard line and you're trying to listen to the 50-yard line, and you're trying to find out what's the point of where is your listening point, that's going to play so many games with all of your musicians based on their maturity level. So that was something we had to discuss too. Who is in charge of where the interpretation is? And that was always center snare, obviously, but the center snare's got to know exactly when you're morphing the rhythm. So we would write in our music, this 7-stroke roll is going to change. This paradiddle is going to push a little bit. And we have to write those little nuanced notes inside of the chart. So, yeah.
Awesome. Hey, another question. what does that, what does that look like? What does that audition process for the old guard look like? And I think the thing that we keep coming back to on this is just the interpretation and knowing those little things. Like, what does that look like with somebody coming through the door that might want to audition for the old guard?
Well, so we tried to break down the rudiments, and this is Scott Jameson did a great job with this. We tried to break down the rudiments and motions. So we came up with about 7 different rudiments that we play, because you still want a lot of the rudiments inside of the breaking down part of the video. So it's a video round first off, and then second off, it's a live in-person audition. So in the first video that you put together, you have to do 7 rudiments, and usually you're starting with the idea of Pratt. So you're up here. They'll do a 7-stroke roll. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll play this together. Now, right there, we're getting to that point where we're no longer stroking every stroke. We're starting to get into rebound. But now you have a choice of what interpretation of the 7-stroke roll are you going to have at top speed. So for here, and. So right there, I could have chosen, or I go into that triplet version of it. So again, there's not a right or wrong. It's what do you want your students to know? And if you can do both of them, then you've just got more tools. So 7-stroke roll, 15-stroke roll, because we want to get some of these interpretation rolls in there. The
Right.
Rudimental is a big one. So the Rudimental being, right, and then you put this the 16th. So, and we're putting that kind of scoop phrasing in there. So everything has this kind of lift to the beat. That's the most important beat. Right. So just like the lesson 25, that's the quarter note. The Rudimental would have that same thing. So we do the Rudimentals, and then you have your other rudiments. There's a prepared piece that we ask everyone to play that everyone has, and then we also have an individual solo that people would want to play on their own. And we always try to say, make sure it's appropriate. Make sure that you're playing something that's appropriate to the style of audition you're going for.
Great. Hey, there's one other question. I think I know this is a great question too, I think for you, from Liz Rockwell. Talks about exploring adding influence in Connecticut halftime from other styles of rudimental drumming. So like maybe do you guys ever take something that's, say, quote unquote traditional and interpret that in a Scottish way, or bring some other ways to think of that into what you're doing?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest influences we had was from Switzerland. And so even the lesson 25 right there, instead of playing, they would put a 5. So it would not be a lesson 25. They call it a final of 7. So a little quick 5-stroke roll. So, you can add that to the lesson 20 or to the lesson 25s there. And that kind of gives you more of that space in there. Scottish, we definitely do that as well. So if you were to play the paradiddles and you kind of make it a dot cut rhythm. So and weirdly enough, that's kind of how a lot of this stuff got started, with hybriding traditional styles. 2006, right. 2007, a few of us were writing music for the old guard. A buddy of mine named Rick Jones and I were on there. A guy named Randy Waterman. We got there and started writing some stuff, and we went, what if we did some of these traditional tunes that are in these 8-bar things? We did 2 bars Swiss, 2 bars Scottish, 2 bars Swiss, and we kept doing this. So we would use the swung patterns, obviously, for the Scottish stuff. Right. Kind of thing. We got that. Alex Coldell and Matt Bell are 2 Scottish drummers that are with the old guard. But then the Swiss stuff was our straight stuff. And so at least it was a predictable method. And I think when it comes to traditional drumming, or traditional rudimental drumming anyway, the prediction of 8-bar phrases is kind of the bread and butter of where that starts. So if you can have something repeated, it's got this traditional style to it. You can anticipate what the next feel is going to be like. But yeah, great question.
Awesome. All right. Well, great, Mark. Well, thanks. I mean, first of all, thanks so much for sharing. I always feel like these have been fun the last couple of weeks. This was super great information. As we all have some time on our hands, so maybe we'll all pull out some Connecticut halftime and dust that off and come back to those rudiments. So thank you so much for.
Why don't we do one all the way down the page and call it a day at that point?
Awesome. Let's do it. Yeah, great.
Everybody there can have this all for their playing enjoyment. Here we go. Connecticut halftime, top to bottom. And there we have it, the whole Connecticut halftime.
Awesome, man. Bravo. Well, listen, thank you again, Mark, for sharing with us today and taking your time to hang out. And it's been very informative and a ton of fun. Thank you guys for tuning in. Definitely let's give Mark Reilly a virtual round of applause and check out next week. I think the fine folks at PAS have some more Fundamental Friday stuff coming at you. So check the Weber Nets for those things, and everybody have a great Friday. Thanks, Mark.
I appreciate it, guys. I'm humbled. Thank you very much.